Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into translating the absolute latest epidemiological data on the global breast cancer burden into a clear, visual scientific briefing. We're going to be analyzing a really comprehensive review paper published in The Breast in 2022 by Arnold and colleagues, which utilizes data from the GlobalCan 2020 database. This paper is absolutely foundational for us because it doesn't just quantify where we are right now, it maps out the critical and, frankly, alarming trajectory of exactly where we're headed. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be moving through 6 key areas, starting with the baseline global burden in 2020, then unpacking the incidence mortality paradox, diving into demographics and risk factors, examining the healthcare survival gap, looking ahead at projections for 2040, and finally, exploring global initiatives. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Global Burden in 2020, our baseline statistics. The sheer scale of this disease is honestly staggering. Breast cancer has officially overtaken lung cancer as the single most commonly diagnosed cancer globally. In the year 2020 alone, there were an estimated 2.3 million new cases of female breast cancer diagnosed worldwide. To put that massive number into a clinical perspective for you, breast cancer now accounts for 1 in every 8 of all cancer diagnoses globally. And if we just look at females, it represents a full quarter of all cancer cases diagnosed. But we really have to contrast that massive number of diagnoses with a very stark reality regarding mortality. In 2020, we saw 685,000 global deaths from breast cancer. That corresponds to 16%, or roughly 1 in every 6 cancer deaths in women worldwide. Now, while survival rates are thankfully high in certain regions, this baseline mortality figure highlights a truly massive global health challenge that we're facing. Geographically speaking, the distribution of these numbers is highly disproportionate. If we look at Figure 1, Eastern Asia accounts for nearly a quarter of all new cases, followed closely by Northern America. But watch what happens when we shift the narrative over to mortality. Africa, for instance, accounts for only 8.3% of global incidence, yet it bears a disproportionately heavy 12.5% of global breast cancer deaths. This instantly signals to us that there is a severe disparity in outcomes depending on where you live. Which brings us directly to Section 2, the incidence mortality paradox and geographic disparities. When we actually map out these age-standardized rates in Figure 2, a really stark paradox emerges. Take a look at the top map showing incidence. The highest rates, we're talking over 80 cases per 100,000 females, are concentrated heavily in Australia, Northern America, and Western Europe. However, look at the bottom map. The mortality burden completely flips. The highest death rates shift dramatically into sub-Saharan Africa and Melanesia. So on a global scale, a high incidence rate absolutely does not perfectly correlate with a high mortality rate. Let's break this down into economic terms using the data from Table 1. Incidence rates are literally more than double in very high Human Development Index nations compared to low HDI nations, 75.7 versus 36.1 per 100,000. Yet look at the mortality rate. It completely inverts. Women living in transitioning, lower HDI economies are significantly less likely to actually get the disease, but they are significantly more likely to die from it. So let's move into Section 3, demographics and risk factors, and start unpacking the why behind all of this. To understand those much higher incidence rates in transitioned countries, we have to look to established reproductive, hormonal, and behavioral risk factors. We're talking about things like an advanced age at first birth, the use of oral contraceptives, along with excess body weight and physical inactivity. And here is the crucial takeaway. As transitioning economies in regions like South America, Africa, and Asia increasingly adopt more westernized lifestyles, the rising prevalence of these exact same risk factors is actively driving up their incidence rates too. Now, globally speaking, breast cancer is primarily concentrated in older populations, but there is a huge exception. Premenopausal mortality is exceptionally high, in fact, about twice as high, in low HDI countries compared to other regions. Why is that? Well, part of it is simply demographic. These regions have a much younger age structure overall. But biology is playing a huge role here too. Women of African descent have a noticeably increased risk of triple-negative breast cancer. That is an aggressive subtype with an earlier onset, and it's heavily exacerbating premenopausal mortality in these populations. This brings us to a really critical part of the conversation. Section 4, the healthcare survival gap, focusing on staging and diagnosis. Because biological factors really only tell us part of the story. The massive disparity in diagnostic timing reveals a profound systemic failure. In high-income countries where established screening programs are the norm, only about 15% of breast cancer cases are diagnosed at the advanced, much harder to treat stages. Contrast that starkly with sub-Saharan Africa, where a staggering 64.9 to 77% of cases present at advanced or even metastatic stages. This incredible diagnostic delay is the direct driver of the mortality gap we keep seeing. The researchers state this unequivocally in the paper. Quote, higher mortality in sub-Saharan Africa is mainly attributable to late-stage presentation and inadequate access to high-quality care. End quote. We need to be clear that this is a structural, systemic healthcare issue. Without early detection and timely multidisciplinary treatment, survival rates just plummet. While the 5-year survival rate exceeds 90% in most high-income countries, it drops all the way down to a devastating 12% in specific sub-Saharan nations. So, what does the future look like? Section 5. Projections for 2040 and the looming crisis. When we project these current numbers out to 2040, basing it on population growth and aging, the forecast in Figure 4 is deeply concerning. Globally, total cases are expected to increase by over 40% and overall mortality by nearly 52%. But I want you to focus on the low HDI regions in these models. They predict a staggering 97.2% increase in new cases and an alarming 98.9% spike in deaths. The burden is literally projected to double in the world's most vulnerable economies. Let those numbers sink in for a moment. If our current trends remain unchanged, the global burden of breast cancer is going to explode. By the year 2040, we will be facing over 3 million new diagnoses annually, and the global death toll will actually surpass 1 million women every single year. And the most unsettling part? This might even be a conservative estimate, considering that incidence rates are actively rising right now in transitioning countries. Section 6. Global Initiatives and How We Start Bridging This Gap. To counteract this rapidly growing burden, the WHO actually launched the Global Breast Cancer Initiative back in 2021. The consensus is clear. We have to immediately transition from just observing this data to actively implementing solutions. That means prioritizing prompt, comprehensive cancer management and using resource-stratified guidelines that are practically tailored to specific economic realities. For limited resource settings, the immediate #1 priority has to be educational campaigns for symptom awareness. Meanwhile, well-resourced settings need to maintain and optimize their organized screening programs. At the end of the day, geography and economic development absolutely should not dictate a patient's prognosis. Yet, as the data clearly shows us today, they do. With over 1 million deaths projected annually by 2040, The most critical question remains: how will the global community successfully implement these public health interventions to bridge this fatal survival gap? Thanks for joining us for this explainer.